You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're all going to need a bigger boat because we're talking about 1983's Jaws 3D. Here we go.
I just need to have it on the background so that I can, it can kind of like a painter. We'll kind of go back and use the brush to kind of just do some flourishes to just a little recoloring.
Sure.
I just needed my memory recolored of just how great Jaws 3D is.
All right, Pete, it's 1983, and I know you were a fan of an avid movie theater goer, and I'm going to guess that a young Pete Charbonneau was probably running to the local Cineplex to watch Return of the Jedi, War Games, maybe Blue Thunder, Krull, or Cujo, one of those movies, right?
Those R-rated movies my parents would not let me in to see. So, but the great thing about 1983 and having a dad who was an electrician was bringing home illegal cable boxes. And so HBO, Showtime, that's where I got to enjoy things such as Cujo, Blue Thunder. That was definitely an HBO staple movie for quite a while. So felt like I was an adult watching adult movies because of illegal cable boxes in our basement.
To paraphrase the Mountain and Muhammad phrase, if you can't bring the Charbonneau to the theater, bring the theater to the Charbonneau.
Yeah, right.
Something like that. And I know you've said...
you can find me in the theater for, Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin. And
I was going to say...
Space Hunter. You can find me in the theater for those classics.
That's right. In 1983, the release of Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. The man who wasn't there, starting the Goot, Steve Guttenberg. Amityville 3D, the third installment in that franchise that seems to have spun off, ballooned. I don't even know what you say about what Amityville has become, but it's certainly deviated from the first movie. And then Treasure of the Four Crowns. We talked about that with Austin Trunick because that's a canon film. So the big question is, Pete, did you see Jaws 3D in the theater in 1983?
I absolutely did. I can remember being in the Smithtown Theater back when it was playing first run films. Eventually became one of those second run theaters. It was a historic theater in the town that I grew up in, Smithtown on Long Island, New York. May have waxed poetic about this before with one of our frequent guests, John Zemsky. But Smithtown Theater was great. It had a balcony, so it had an aura to it. And I still have very fond memories of seeing films there. I can remember seeing Superman 2 in the theater there. Saw Flash Gordon, my dad's favorite movie in the Smithtown Theater. And saw Jaws 3D in the same theater. And I can remember being hyped for it. There was a teaser trailer that came out some months before the release. And it was, it had one of the famous voiceover artists that was kind of leading you into it, and there's slow music that sounds kind of familiar, but you're not quite sure if you can place it, and it talks about creatures lived on the earth for millions of years. It's a mindless killing machine. And then it goes, and the screen is black, and then all of a sudden you get basically a rectangular shape appears and you see water. And then it starts saying the first one terrified you beyond your wildest imaginations.
1 aroused your fear like no movie before it. Then, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, 2 continued the legend. Now, the all-new Jaws 3D. This time, the terror of Jaws will not stop at the edge of the screen. Jaws 3D.
Oh my God.
Rated PG, parental guidance suggested.
That was all you needed for the hype. It wasn't any scene from the film. It was just that 1 minute hype trailer. And I was like, oh my God, this is going to be the greatest thing ever. Because I had seen the first 2 in the theater, way too young. Parents took me to see Jaws and Jaws 2 in the drive-in. Gave me nightmares and a healthy fear of the water like many other people. Fascinated with sharks because of that. And even Jaws 2, which I think is a very solid sequel, left an indelible mark on me. And so when Jaws 3 was coming out, I was super excited. I was, I was 11, about to be 12 years old. And these were all PG. So you didn't have to worry about going to sneak into a rated R Jaws movie because they were somehow all rated PG. And when you're 11, 12, 13, 6 years between films is basically a lifetime. It really is it was like half my life. So to have experienced the first two and have been terrified, but still just in love with both of those films, to have to wait 6 years from Jaws 2, or maybe it was 5 years, to get the sequel, it just felt like, oh my God, they're bringing this back. This is crazy. It's incredible. And so I was excited.
And in your young lifetime too, you've been able to see all of them. It's not like any of them were released before you were born.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I was barely old enough to comprehend the first one. I spent most of Jaws like in the back seat of the family station wagon, like, hiding under blankets because it was a little too intense for me. And the second one I saw more of. And so, I'm like, yeah, give me more Jaws action, because it was, right up my 12-year-old alley. And so I was super excited, less so after leaving the theater, but we'll get into that. That was my Jaws 3D experience back in the day. What was yours?
Well, Jaws was always played around, it seems like, the 4th of July, at least in my neck of the woods. And I think you and John have always talked about picks in your neck of the woods in New York. And I mean, this was a big deal, but that's how I saw it when it was released in like a Jaws marathon type format around the 4th of July. And I didn't see Jaws in the theater, but I saw it early on and scared the heck out of me. Did not want to go around water, didn't want to be around fish. And then when I finally did start watching it later on in my teen years, I started to appreciate it for what Jaws was. So I was like, yes, they made more of these. I will watch more.
First comes the fear.
I think we may have another shark problem.
Then panic sets in.
Are you serious? You bet I'm serious.
It ends in hysteria.
That's a shark. I've seen one up close. Come on! And you better do something about this one, because I don't intend to go through that hell again.
Jaws 2, part of the Jaws 4th of July picnic. All day, July 4th.
You get Jaws at 7 to like 9, so it's prime time. You get Jaws Part 2, 9 to 11. And then if you're watching it on like WGN in my neck of the woods in the Chicagoland area, all right, well, Jaws 3 maybe kicks in at like 11:30 after the local news. And after you start watching Jaws 3, maybe you don't want to. Maybe you just get a good night's rest and you just don't watch it anymore. That was my memory. It was kind of fleeting. It wasn't memorable. And if anything, not to deride the movie, it just reminded me how great of a technical marvel, how clever the original movie was, that it just made me realize, wow, what Spielberg did, the fact that now, as we've done this show and we've kind of gone back, and now that we look back at these movies we grew up with that we never even had a second thought about, to think that Jaws was the template of what would become like the summer blockbuster, right? It's not until 1975 that we could now use that for Independence Day or all the Marvel movies that take advantage of that tentpole 4th of July idea that people go to the theater to see this. And then when you see something like Jaws 3, and let alone Jaws 3D, which is as much taking advantage of the franchise as it is taking advantage of the 3D trend, which is one of the reasons why we're talking about this movie, because we've talked about so many of these 80s 3D movies that we had to eventually talk about Jaws 3D. So while not necessarily on the top of my list of movies that I might have in like the queue to watch on like some rotation, I remember Jaws 3D. It's just more than anything, it just reminded me always anytime it was on that I probably just needed to give Jaws another rewatch.
Sure. And I think, Jaws wouldn't be Jaws if the shark had worked the way it was supposed to from the get-go, and how you talk about movie magic and kismet and all these things, and something that from a technical standpoint, shooting out in open water with this, mechanical behemoth that just refused to ever work. But then that turns the film into one of the most incredibly suspenseful, intense movies of all time, and is obviously a stone cold classic. Pretty incredible.
And it fulfills the promise that it puts out to say it made people afraid of going into the water.
Right. And unfortunately, it gave sharks a really bad name, I think much to Peter Benchley's, disappointment because that wasn't necessarily his intention. But that certainly kicked off. Like, it wasn't so much that people were now afraid of sharks, but it was like people were actively out. We've got to kill every shark that we see, and
Sure.
and overfishing of sharks. When I think at this point, thanks in part to Shark Week and things like that, but educational programs that have shown that we're basically invading their domain, and most shark attacks are accidents. It's not sharks aren't actively looking around for Dennis Quaid or Bess Armstrong or Roy Scheider swimming or hanging out in the water. Like it's nature and man colliding, and unfortunate events happen. So we've talked about Star Wars a lot and how that like shaped our youth and things like that, and how that world has grown to what it's been in the 40 some odd years since that exploded onto the scene. But Jaws in many ways, which obviously preceded Star Wars, and as you mentioned, like the first real summer blockbuster, just really kicked open the doors on a new era and level of filmmaking that had not existed prior to that. So that's the template that we're working with.
I was going to say, to build the bridge to Jaws 3, did you see Jaws 2 in the theater?
I did, yes. Okay. Like I said, like I and maybe in hindsight, it's because of the sequels that came after it. But I always really enjoyed Jaws 2. I've heard it, described as an unnecessary sequel, and that's probably right. I mean, you're not going to improve on Jaws, but the fact that most of the principal cast was back, even though Roy Scheider definitely did not want to be, was contractually obliged to be in Jaws 2, but still gives a great performance. And you've got, Spielberg wasn't there, but Joe Alves, Carl Gottlieb punched up the script. It felt and it looked like a continuation of Jaws. And so from that standpoint, I felt like, well, this is just furthering the story. A little preposterous that Amity is being attacked by a second shark again, but whatever, you go along with it. And I've always very much enjoyed Jaws 2, still to this day. Again, having those two in my young brain, when Jaws 3 hits the theaters, I was like, we've got to go see this. And, and being super excited for it, without spoiling too much, feeling incredibly let down coming out of the theater.
The interesting thing about this movie, again, having not really seen it in a very long time, one, it made me again realize Jaws is great. Jaws 2 is a bit of a redux of Jaws 1, or even the plotting seems very similar, except we really just don't get the Dreyfuss Quinn character to kind of partner up with Brody. So Brody just takes that on his own. I mean, we even still get the line at the end where he electrifies the shark, it bites into the cable. And I had to watch just a few scenes on YouTube to just refresh myself. And I'm like, oh, wait, that's right. He has the scene with the mayor. All the plot points of the original are kind of redone again for part 2. And in some ways, it could seem lazy, but I mean, I think, when I was looking at it, the box office for part 2, it was the third highest grossing film in 1978, only behind Grease and Animal House. So the fact that it was basically kind of giving people more of what they wanted, I don't begrudge the studio for doing that, especially now when I can see that, like you said, Jaws 2, it's an okay film. It's not Jaws. It could never be Jaws. And it's not until you get to Jaws 3 that I think either we're at fault, Pete, for looking for more. I don't know if the movie's at fault for not delivering more when there were a few things there it could do. But I just wonder if a lot of this too is in doing a little research for 3 for this conversation and realizing that, I don't know if you knew this, that Jaws 3 was supposed to be a spoof, like in the vein of Airplane. So you had heard that before?
Yeah, it was supposed to be a National Lampoon.
Unbelievable.
Jaws 3, People Zero.
Yes. That's a great title. I mean, and it works. You bring in the National Lampoon's people. You bring in actually like David Brown and Richard Zanuck, who actually produced Airplane. Yeah. So
I think John Hughes was attached to write this.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. There's an alternate universe where that movie exists, and seems like there was enough inertia to like make that happen. I did read that like Joe Dante was also approached to direct. The Piranha makes sense.
But that could have been a very fun, very different sequel.
Yes, I read some notes where I guess it opened with the novel's author, Peter Benchley. He was eaten by a shark in his pool, It was supposed to feature a naked Bo Derek and a bunch of aliens dressed up in shark costumes. You hear that now, and if you grew up with Airplane 1 and 2 or Top Secret or Animal House, none of those plot elements seem preposterous. That kind of makes sense, but that's not what we saw. And it seems like the studio was nervous enough from what I was reading that they decided to go in a different direction. I'm sure it didn't hurt that Spielberg also did not appreciate the Jaws 3 People Zero idea. Let's maybe right the ship and get this closer to what Jaws 2 was, whether it was unnecessary or not. They bring in Richard Matheson, who'd worked on Twilight Zone movie. He'd created I Am Legend. That became, Omega Man with Charlton Heston. I guess he writes an outline for it. Carl Gottlieb comes back after working on 1 and 2, puts the screenplay together for 3. And like you said, then you bring in Joe Alves, who'd worked on as production, I guess.
I think he was second director on some scenes for Jaws 1 and 2 as well. So he gets promoted to direct.
And the Spielberg connection, because he had worked on Sugarland Express and on Close Encounters. And I thought I read he was nominated for an Academy Award for Close Encounters. And he'd worked with John Carpenter on Escape from New York. So again, having seen the movie, not spoiling what I think maybe our feelings about the movie may be, if you were just looking at that, it checks a lot of the boxes. Everything is moving towards a sequel that is more of the same. You were going towards the parody, you put the brakes on that. Now you're moving towards a Jaws 3 that feels probably more like a Jaws 2. And then Alves comes in, and I guess they were working on a Creature from the Black Lagoon reboot. They had some test footage, and the studio liked it so much that Joe Alves was able to convince them, if you guys think this works, what if we throw in Jaws? And I guess at the time it was supposed to be a TV movie. It had TV movie budget, and they were able to throw money at it, $18 million in production, and layer on top the 3D element. Again, like, you're checking boxes, especially in 1983, where 3D is a gimmick that is getting asses in seats.
Yeah, and using the tagline, "The third dimension is terror," which I think Friday the 13th also used. It's interesting. I'm curious if you have the same feelings that I do about this, because this is a movie that there's been several times over the last bunch of years where I've either come across it or have been thinking about Jaws and maybe watched Jaws 1 and 2. I'm like, do I kick on and watch the third one again? Because like you, it's been many years since I've seen this. There's always something with this movie that holds me back from wanting to see it. And I don't know if it's necessarily one thing. I have a feeling that as I talk through this with you on this episode, they'll come to the fore. But I mean, I'll say this about the movie. There are a couple of interesting ideas, but the execution is not great. The pacing for me has always been way off. I think that's probably one of my main issues, that the pacing, it drags at some points.
Yes.
Like, tension is not really there.
I actually don't dislike this movie, especially now having seen it for this conversation. I think the biggest sin it commits is that it's kind of boring at times. And,
yes.
And I think that maybe is the worst thing about it. I watched it last night and realizing, like, you're right, this wasn't suspenseful. There were things that felt like it was missing. And then I thought to myself, but wait, am I judging it in comparison to Jaws 1 or even Jaws 2 that does those things well? Like, am I disliking this movie or hating on it because it's bad? Is it now in the, like, so bad it's good category? We've watched a lot of bad movies, Pete, and I have felt bad about watching some of those movies where not in a, like, and I think we have the same belief, right? Like, the fact that somebody makes a movie, like, we celebrate that, right? Like, it's great. We take that high road, you could say, where we're like, it's a miracle that it was made at all. We don't hate watch it. Sometimes some are not as memorable than others. In this 3D category, when we stumble on movies like Silent Madness, we welcome it because we're like, wait, how did an 80s slasher in 3D get past us? Gimme. I want to see this now and I want to talk about it. Then I see this. Yeah, I didn't dislike it as much as I thought I was going to. It's just that the pacing is so off. Am I judging it too harshly?
Yeah, that's possible. It's like almost impossible to know because, how can you remove it from Jaws that comes before it? So I think any sequel is going to suffer in comparison when you've got one of the greatest films of all time that's, obviously that's an opinion, but I think that's a pretty well-regarded opinion that it's one of the best films, certainly one of the best American films of all time. So
the internet, the purveyor of all facts, would probably agree with you in some fashion. Yes.
Yeah, and I checked with them before we
good.
record, so I want to make sure I had backup. but yeah, no, I think you nailed it with I mean, when it's boring, it's really boring. And we've talked about this, and I brought this up on a couple of episodes about not wanting to get making films too personal to like your own viewing experience, where you're just kind of like, well, if I was making this film now, this is what I would do. And I would rearrange this, and put this here and do this, and then take this part out and do this. But that being said, I always go back to me, like I said, there's a couple of interesting things about this. The setting being in a theme park, SeaWorld, somehow attaching their name to this movie. Interesting choice.
Would you say logical choice kind of makes sense as like a setting?
Yeah, I think, you can't. And what you were talking about, like Jaws 2 being very much like a template of Jaws with a couple of little different things. You introduce more young characters.
It happened on the other side of Amity Island.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you have to switch things up a little bit. And so moving it to SeaWorld in a theme park where there's this new underwater kingdom opening up, I'm like, okay, so that's an interesting idea. You bring back Mike and Sean Brody to have that connective tissue, which I don't think was needed. Probably one of the things that the film suffers is that connective tissue. Probably would have been better to do the clean break, but I think, again, that was a studio must-have. And I don't think Richard Matheson and Carl Gottlieb necessarily wanted to have it be the Brody brothers having the shark, another shark incident come along that they just can't seem to get away from this kind of trauma. So I think that dings it a little bit, but it's also weird because the film doesn't go all in on the fact that these are definitely the same grown-up kids from Jaws and Jaws 2. It's like, yes, this is them, but they don't beat it over your head, which I guess is commendable in a way, but it also muddles it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the most interesting thing about this is the undersea kingdom part. And I think if the movie had focused more on the shark kind of terrorizing people that get trapped in there, and then it becomes more of like a survival thing as they move from section to section and how are they going to get themselves out. I think if you kind of really hone in on that one aspect of it, it might have worked better as a movie, as opposed to let's introduce, a couple of different characters. We've got like the park. A shark gets into the park. Turns out it's just a baby, and then the mother's in there. So there's like that little bit of misdirection. The tension's not there, and then the parts where there's really no shark action are just really, really dull and really, really boring. And it's kind of hard for you to get from action point A to action point C when B is just so kind of good.
Yes, 100% agree with you, especially, again, watching it now and really paying attention to the fact that they made it a point to bring in the two Brody brothers. They have the quick throwaway line about their dad, their history, the shark attacks. But to your point, then the movie or the characters seem to have a bit of a amnesia about their traumatic events. It's like they used it, but they didn't pay it off, like you said. And in some ways, I wonder if that actually hurt the Bess Armstrong character. There are times where she's very much the lead, and her perspective that let's bring in this shark and let's not kill him on live TV the way Louis Gossett Jr.'s character and then the hunter Philip, I think, Manimal Guy. That's how I remember.
Like I remember
Animal Guy.
Like, hey, it's an animal.
That's right. The fact that they're thinking of it as an attraction, but a one-time attraction. And she's thinking of it as piece of an amusement in the same way that they have, oh my God, so much water skiing in this. Dear Lord, water skiing. But it's an interesting perspective because you're surrounded in the first movie, right, by a lot of people who want to kill the shark. And they do. The second movie, let's do it again. And in this one, you have the one person that's like, maybe we don't kill it. And it feels like there was something there, but because it was maybe weighed by the Brody brothers, but never really fully paid off to the point where after one of the attacks, Sean and Leah Thompson, feature film debut, disappear. they're just like, hey, I'm going to go with her to the hospital. And now we're done.
And they're gone.
The kid who, for about 2 seconds, and I'm not going to hold it against him because I get it. Young Leah Thompson, she's very attractive. And, he spent time in Colorado, get away from water as much as possible. Here's this very attractive young woman. Let's go make out in the water. I might go into the water, Pete. I understand that. But it seems like he had a quick amnesia about being terrorized by a massive shark not too long ago and having it happen twice to his family. Nevertheless, those are the parts where I kind of did judge the movie. I'm like, if you're going to use it, use it. If you're not going to use it,
lean into it a little bit more. Yeah, because I think you nailed it. There's no payoff with the Brody storyline. Like they introduce it, it's like, yep, here you go. Here's your little aside. Talk about my dad had some incidents with a couple of sharks, and we're going to move on. But then it's just done. You're feeling a little bit like, well, just can we get a little bit more? Like, I understand you may not want to like be so overbearing with it, but like, yeah, if you're introducing them as characters, then you kind of expect there to be more of a through line. And to your point about Bess Armstrong, I think she does a phenomenal job in this movie, a film that you would never be pointing anyone out for their acting, but I think she's such a good actress. Totally buy her as not just the head marine biologist. I don't know if that was her official title, but that
sounds right.
But she's with the dolphins. She's with the orcas.
Yep. And she has the hell of an intro where she literally, like, I was waiting for the cut where she's riding that orca killer whale, just drops her off so she can see her boyfriend Dennis Quaid, who's Mike Brody. And I'm like, all right, here's the cut where you're going to see that it wasn't her.
Right.
Like, oh wait, that was her. Wow. Okay. Like,
it's like some guy with a 5 o'clock shadow and a blonde wig, and then like the quick cut. Then she gets up onto the platform.
That's what we're used to. Yes. Yeah.
She clearly did some time training with the orcas, and and this is well before Blackfish. So again, like you kind of take this for what it is. SeaWorld, very different era. The trainers, I think, do the best that they can with these animals that should in no way be held in, tiny tanks relative to their size. But, she clearly had worked with this animal. There was a rapport there that you see on the screen. I just found her completely charming and believable as Mike Brody's fiance. Like they have a rapport. If you told me that they were married or that they were dating off screen, I would be like, I totally get it, because I just see the chemistry there. And I think that's just a testament to the work that she's doing. So, there's a good acting performance in there. And she's kind of the moral conscious, like you said, like, they capture this juvenile great white. She wants to, make sure that it survives and lives, where Louis Gossett Jr., fresh off of An Officer and a Gentleman and an Academy Award, is now playing Clarence Bouchard, head of SeaWorld.
Park manager, yes.
Park manager. And
the role of like the mayor, right? Like the bureaucrat that's like, well, we can't close down the park because the pumps cost $2 million to run, and we're not going to do that. But also, again, maybe leaning into the theme we might run into here often, Pete, is but never fully really leaning into like the bad guy role, and never like kind of twirling the mustache to be like, we're not going to lose out on the money on the concessions. We're not going to lose out on this, guys. Like, we're going to keep operating. There is still a part of him that's like, well, let's move the people to safety. And if the experts are telling us not to do this, then we're not going to do that. Either be the bad guy, or I guess be the good guy, because you're Louis Gossett Jr. You're an Iron Eagle. Come on now. Like, I want to give me that guy.
Like, when they wrote his character, like, let's do a slightly more evolved Murray Hamilton from Jaws, the Jaws mayor, Mayor Vaughn. And so we'll give him a little bit more of a conscience. And then it's weird, because for a movie that takes place at SeaWorld and, kind of invites you into this like larger world, I feel like the cast is like really tiny, because you've got Dennis Quaid, Bess Armstrong, Louis Gossett Jr., Manimal, and his partner. And he's kind of like, wildlife photographer, famous wildlife photographer. And he just goes and, he comes on the scene. And of course, once the shark shows up, it's like, this is like a chance of a lifetime for him. Other than that, where like you've got the Sean Brody and Leah Thompson, who plays one of the water skier, crew, everyone else is just kind of there.
the thing that struck a chord with me this time is that the movie plays all the beats of a slasher film, especially in that first kill with the scuba diver Overman. You know, because there's a lot of those scenes in this that are on land. Although, to be fair, there's a lot of scenes that actually do take place underwater. So I kind of want to give them that credit. They did not skimp on underwater scenes, and we're not even going to get into the 3D yet because that's going to be its own segment. But the scuba diver goes in the water to fix something because the gates aren't opening properly because some guy snuck in and they kind of screwed up the gates that prevent sharks from getting into the bins, into the areas. And the way that scene played with him turning around and there's nothing there, reacting again, it's just slasher 101 with every 80s horror slasher film that we've seen. But then to turn around and then, of course, something is there and the music plays into it. But it's also not like there's a lot of those moments because we've been kind of trained that with the slasher trope come the body count, right? Like there will be victims. So we're going to introduce a camp full of kids who are trying to bring Crystal Lake back to life. Why? Because if you start with 10, by the time the movie's at the hour and 19-minute mark, you will be down to 2. And that's how this works. And in a movie like this, if they're going to set this up as a kind of a slasher, there's not a lot of staff that they're showcasing here to go through. So I was 100% thinking, I'm like, oh, did I forget that maybe one of the Brody brothers die? Because the body count has to go higher, and it never does. It's like they kind of stay pretty tight, and the shark doesn't go on the spree that you think it would. Or sharks, for a little bit of a spoiler for people that may not have seen this movie.
Yeah,
but,
to quote another slasher, more famous slasher movie, totally.
Totally. Totally silly.
I was just waiting for more kills, more things to happen. The one comment I'll make about Bess and her character, if you wanted to have some connective tissue to the first movie, I totally get it. Again, I don't begrudge the studio for that. You could have also just have made her Hooper's mentor, colleague. There were other connections there to be made that would have rationalized her perspective and would have given us what the studio wanted us to be. It's like, oh, look, these people are connected to the first movie. You should pay attention because there's lore that we're building on instead of lore that they're not fully taking advantage of. And it felt like you could take out the Brody brothers and totally just lean into Bess, or just made Quaid, the guy who's in charge of maintenance and repairs and making sure that no one gets overtime for some reason, because we hear that so many times, and just be like, you know what, make her Hooper's mentor, colleague, whatever it is. And then she can refer to the events of the first movie and how Matt told me about this shark and this feels like that. Now we get that moment to talk about all of that stuff. So the audience is like, oh yeah, that's right, I saw those films. Got it.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that slasher angle because I completely agree with you thinking back on it now. And it makes sense because by 83, the slasher genre is pretty firmly established. And so, yeah, why wouldn't you do that? I think you can almost make that case too for like Jaws 2, because the shark basically, stalks a bunch of, instead of camp counselors, they're a bunch of kid sailboat enthusiasts. So it's almost kind of the same thing, picking them off one by one. This leans into it a little bit more, but I go back again to just like the lack of tension right from the get-go. So you've got like before even the opening credits, you've got like the POV shot. There's a fish. There's a kind of a quick cut, and you got like a cloud of blood and the fish's head, which his mouth is still moving, very clearly a 3D shot. And then it opens up on the water ski team, and you get introduced very briefly to Leah Thompson's character. She kind of makes a comment. Everyone falls off of the pyramid into the water. You've already seen the fin, so you know there's a shark. And it's like the moment of like the camera is like slowly creeping up on everyone in the water, as of course the boat won't restart, so you can't get moving again. But of course it does.
With all the dangly legs in the water that we're now like, oh, we know that's no good.
Yeah. And but then of course it does, and everyone moves off. You've seen it before, and like you know what they're trying to do, but there's no tension there to it. Like I never for once thought like, oh, we're gonna get like a massive attack right off the bat. And I almost was like picturing the shark like underwater. And then once like the team takes off, it kind of like snaps its fin like, dang, so close. But that kind of unfortunately sets the scene for the rest of the film. And so, I kept being like, where's the tension in this? Where's like the dread? There's a couple of scenes where you kind of see where things are going because they hint at stuff like, oh, the dolphins don't want to go out into the lagoon. Well, we know why, because there's a great white two great whites in there. So there's like little things like that if they had paid off a little bit more, it'd be like, okay, so this is like establishing the fact that, don't go into the lagoon. It lingers very briefly and it doesn't really ever ratchet up enough, in my opinion, to really make it worthwhile. And then going back to the boring aspect of it, whatever scene that they try to build that tension, it then goes off to, a scene of Mike Brody like riding his easy go around SeaWorld, going from place to place and then meeting and talking about this. And we got to get the park open and all this other stuff. And there's just so much going on that really kind of superfluous. And I'm all for character development, but it wasn't really character development. It was just really, let's go from place to place here. And, that's right. We got to get back to the fact that there's a 35-foot shark in this movie.
That's right. There's a story that I heard where I guess James Cameron was in front of Fox studio executives and he wrote Alien on a chalkboard, and they were talking about why they would make a sequel to it. And he just put a $ where the S would be, make the point that like, why do you do this? Well, obviously he was able to tell a very good story and expand on Alien and what Ridley Scott did. And I think this movie does that. And I guess this is, spoiler territory, but I appreciate the fact that they have not one, but two sharks. And I appreciate the fact that they also have basically the baby shark be the initial shark that we see, to then realize that there is a mother shark, a larger shark that's supposed to be the big deal for the movie. I get it. Like in Alien, you get one. Aliens, it's plural. You will get more. But that's where I'm like, if you can have two of them, why not have them stalking? And then if you give us the reveal that it's a mother and baby shark, there's so much already here that you don't have to pivot much to get the pieces together to put together a pretty solid sequel to a franchise. There's a lot of pieces there.
Yeah, and and they really hold off like the dun 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 like reveal that like, no, that's not the shark that killed Overman. There's a bigger shark in the lagoon. They're like, oh shit. They don't really play that up until kind of like halfway through the movie. And this is a quirky thing that maybe other people might be able to relate to. I know I thought this at the time. Again, when I was a kid, I remember being like slightly disappointed when in Jaws, they're like, oh, the shark's a 20-footer. And, like Quint's like 25. And I was like, yeah, like I'm thinking like bigger should be better. And, kids, bigger does not always mean better, just so you know. But I was like, oh, but, if I want a monster shark, I'm thinking like 35, 40 foot. Not knowing at the time that great whites just don't grow that large.
Sure.
And an 18-foot, 20-foot great white shark is still pretty fucking big and pretty fucking terrifying. But like I remember at the time with Jaws being like, only 20, 25 feet?
I can take them.
And so to see how they like ramped it up here, like, oh, we've got a 35-foot, great white in this one, which is, I'm a little lax in my great white knowledge. I want to say that like 30 feet might be about the largest great white that's ever been recorded. So, you're already pushing the boundaries of what realistically could be there. But again, it's a movie, so you go along with it. But I was like, oh, cool. They're introducing like giant shark that's going to come and wreak havoc on SeaWorld. And like you said, like it doesn't really happen.
And you mentioned the Overman guy, because his morgue reveal was pretty gory. I thought like the reveal of his head was pretty gnarly for a movie that got a PG rating. And seeing that reveal of Overman like takes too long. You get he disappeared. His girlfriend at the bar confronts Quaid and Bess. Have you seen Overman? Well, tell him he can't come back because maybe he's gone away with that other girl, and I wouldn't take him back anyway. They find a duffel bag. It has his ID and money. Maybe he's not run away with another girl. Maybe something bad happened to him. And then his head is discovered. And then he's in the morgue. In a traditional type of slasher film where like the XY axis is like with sequel comes more gore, more body. I was like, okay, you can't linger on the one kill for like 20 minutes of screen time here. You got to rack up a few more. Like there are other people that obviously can't get overtime that we've seen that are divers here. You got to wipe them all out somehow. I get it, as gnarly as that morgue reveal is. And, kudos to them for the makeup work. Guys, this is dragging. You've got to move this forward a little faster because that's not working. And the 3D effects aren't necessarily doing it for me either.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue because I was going to say, I think, we've talked quite a bit about what doesn't work about Jaws 3D, but it is a 3D movie.
We feel this is a breakthrough film in 3D, certainly state of the art. We've never seen pictures that look as well, and we know that the projection and the glasses are all going to make it very, very exciting filmic experience.
And so let's talk a little bit about some of the 3D effects.
Yes. Well, you mentioned one, the beginning title screen, which again, talk about gnarly. That's a really solid way to introduce a Jaws sequel, let alone a Jaws sequel in 3D. That bitten off, still alive and mouth still moving head that was just ripped off by our first shark, that had to have been in 3D, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, you can see the composite over, on the screen. And I'm trying to remember, obviously I'm going back many, many years when I saw it in the theater. So I don't really remember wow factor 3D stuff. I did read that I think the initial plan for this was to have 3D act more as depth.
I read that too, yeah. Producers
or Universal was like, no, we need more stuff flying out at the screen, so go back and shoots.
which again, maybe that again goes to this running theme that we're kind of setting up for this movie, that if you're going to do this and you're going to lean into two sharks and kind of some of these slasher horror elements, then ramp it up. More kills, keep it going. If you're going to do this in 3D, I might actually side with the studio this time. Sorry, Joe. Joe Alves, the director, and say, I get it. The depth of field is really cool. And they certainly have some scenes in that underwater area where I can imagine if you're in the theater, it's got to be really cool to see that depth of vision with the water and those tunnels. I'm like, I get it. That's neat. But it's also a 3D film. You're going to have some stuff come at us, jump at us in very inopportune times so that, we kind of know the harpoon is coming at us, but it worked for Jason. So I'm okay if you're going to lean into it here.
Yeah, and having two dolphins jumping out of the water is like, okay, that's cute, but
it can't be that. Really... It can't just be that.
You don't go to Jaws 3D hoping to see a couple of dolphins jumping out of the screen. That's not really gonna make it worth the price of admission.
Even if you end it with a freeze frame that makes it seem like the cutest movie you've ever seen, it's like, wait, is this the ending from Flipper? Nope, Jaws 3D. Jaws 3D. That's right. Any moments in it from the 3D aspect that I know there's the one iconic one that we're both going to have to talk about for sure. But any 3D moments that just like I can see where that was 3D and that could have been cool.
When you watch it on Tubi or on your streaming service of your choice, I think this movie, maybe more than a lot of the other ones that we've talked about, it becomes glaringly obvious, like a lot of the composite stuff. Like I remember the scene, there's like a submersible yellow vehicle that almost looks like a manta.
That's right.
Fish.
Is that the scene where it's going in front of the Spanish galleon?
Yes. Yeah. And it's like very clearly composited over it. So, and I think that must have been to give it that depth feel. But I mean, really, Jaws 3D, if you're talking about Jaws 3, it really all comes down to like the climactic scene, like for better or for worse. And I think most people would say for worse, that shows like really the limitations of what you're dealing with here and the limitations of the technology at the time, because it's you don't want to trash something just to trash it, but it's just so bad. It's so bad. And I remember at the time thinking, I'm like, this is stupid.
Yes. And I think that's why, I mean, this is where we have this cross section in this conversation about all these 80s 3D films. This is not the first time where we've heard Jaws thrown under the bus, where folks have said, especially, our friend Earl Owensby, who produced quite a few 3D movies on his own, talking about how Jaws 3D was kind of the nail in the coffin that stopped the craze, because you had that really bad Venn diagram of bad movie with poorly executed 3D effects, where maybe people were realizing, okay, this is a gimmick, but this isn't even a really good gimmick. And that glass scene where Mama Shark is coming through, it is kind of laughable, and not like in a, wow, like this is bad. Like you were saying, that it was bad then. So now we actually are seeing it, I think, with a little bit of nostalgia goggles on. We're like, yeah, it's okay. Like, it's fine. I can see why this was bad, but I'm not going to hate on it. Back then, I imagine, you're in the theater. You're like, Metal Storm: The Destruction of Jared Sin was basically like only second to Godfather now. Like, this is like, come on.
Exactly. Yes. That's exactly my thoughts, was like, yeah, Metal Storm: The Destruction of Jared Sin just moved way up the list of all-time films because
that's right.
Those three. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you can look at it now and be like, oh, this is super campy. And yes. I know that Jaws 3 has a fair number of fans out there that like consider it like a quirky addition to the Jaws franchise. I would say that it's certainly way more watchable than the fourth one. But at the time, the destruction of the shark was everything. Roy Scheider blows up an air tank with the rifle in the original. The second one, he electrocutes the shark. So it's like,
great scene too, especially because it gets very graphic, very visceral with the electricity. Like, yep. It works.
Yep. And so, so you have to, I guess, I'm sure that they felt some pressure to be like, well, how do we, if not top those, like compete with those so that it's, something on par, or that something is memorable. And so, I mean, for anyone that hasn't seen it, the shark is laying siege to the underwater kingdom. There's like the control room area that kind of oversees the lagoon that Louis Gossett, I think there's two other, basically chum humans, Dennis Quaid and Bess Armstrong are in there, and the shark decides to attack it. And it's just like a slow motion shot of, basically what looks like a model of the great white, like slowly coming towards the screen. And then it stops, the glass breaks. It doesn't, from a physics standpoint, make any sense whatsoever, and floods the thing. The shark still has a grenade in its mouth from when it eats Fitzroyce earlier. Mm-hmm. And Dennis Quaid is able to get a hook in there and pull the pin, blowing up the shark in a great big red cloud underwater that all parts come shooting out. And then, of course, like the top and bottom jaws of the shark like end up, right there in front of you on camera. Clearly, again, not so much like a shootout at the camera, but more like the depth of field 3D shot. And and then, as you mentioned earlier, they swim to the surface, and the dolphins break the surface, and freeze frame, happy ending, fun, light music, and let's all go home.
and everyone's going home. I did read that they did bring in a 3D specialist, Chris Condon, who's come up a few times in our conversations now, because he worked on Parasite in 1982 for Charles Band. He worked on Metal Storm: Destruction of Jared Sin, came out in 83, and he worked on the Earl Owensby movie. So he worked on Rottweiler, Chain Gang, Hyperspace. I guess they had some issues with the production. They lost 9 days worth of shooting because they couldn't figure out how to get the 3D to work. And even beyond that, I guess the studio at one point did cut out, I read, 30 minutes from the movie. So if you thought the movie dragged before, Pete, there's another 30 minutes that I have to imagine. And again, knowing not much more than the kind of research I like to do for some of these kind of superficial, I figure, hey, Wikipedia will give you more answers than we want to. We just talk about our impressions, our feelings about these movies, how they impact us, how we remember them. But I have to think, Pete, those 30 movies are probably not scenes that they would have invested in makeup and in 3D effects. There are probably a lot of exposition scenes that probably slowed a movie down that already had pacing issues to begin with.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did come across an article on the Daily Jaws, which is a great site if you are a fan of the franchise. They recently did like a retrospective on Jaws 2, where they did a series of video interviews with a lot of the actors and also the director, Jeannot Schwartz, who is a French, I believe French director, who came in. The original director was fired. He came in on
That's right. Yeah.
I think there's an interesting story about the making of Jaws 2. In this article, they talked about like the original script for Jaws 3 was going to be pretty different than what ended up on screen, which happens a lot. Like this is not like some great revelation. But what they talked about was that there was going to be a lot more character development between the Brody brothers, and they leaned a lot heavier on the trauma, and their experiences on Amity Island and the legacy of their dad and things like that. It sounded like might have made for a better film overall. But again, like I don't know, without having seen the entire script and only briefly reading the summary of what was meant to be, if you're going more into character development and fleshing out some of the characters, I think that still leaves you with where's the tension. Yes. And how do you kind of tighten this up so that you're really bringing people along into something that's going to be, again, we talked about it earlier, Jaws, the original blockbuster popcorn summer feature. Yes, yet terrifying, but still supposed to be fun on some level, on some very visceral level. I just feel like Jaws 3D is just not that much fun, and I think that's my main issue with it. Like again, a couple of scenes and a couple of really good ideas, but it's just not fun enough for me that, to want to keep going back and seeing it. And I appreciate people that enjoy it for what it is and find it quirky and find it interesting. That's awesome. I just, having seen it when I was a kid and leaving the theater disappointed, it's always kind of stuck with me that it's just not quite what I wanted and still doesn't really hold up for me to want to go back and do a bunch of revisits of it.
There's a delicate balance, I think, with a lot of these creature features. And I think the big one for me is always any of the Godzilla films that, we saw on, again, in your neck of the woods, it was probably Pix. I was just watching the Chicagoland version of Pix where they would do those Godzilla marathons, and there was never enough Godzilla. Get the people off the screen. I want to see Godzilla stomping a car, destroying a building, fighting Monster Zero. I want to see more of that and less people talking. And I think this, in Jaws 3, they seem to forget. And again, maybe that was the original direction. I appreciate that. Maybe that's some of the 30 minutes they took out. Maybe that was part of it, the characterization and building on the trauma and the true brothers. But even if you give them credit for all that, it's like, man, you guys didn't even give us enough Godzilla. You didn't give us enough creature. You didn't give us enough shark on screen, so that even if that's all we had, that almost would have been enough to make this a little bit more memorable and maybe push it into the Jaws 2 category and not necessarily into the Jaws 4 shark with psychic bond with Brody's wife type category, which is its own thing.
Yelling in pain.
Yes, because of course sharks do that. They yell.
They have feelings too.
Something I don't begrudge Michael Caine. I'm sure that was probably a nice Caribbean vacation for him. Yep. Good on him to be able to take advantage of studio money to get paid for a movie and probably get a nice tan while he was at it too. Yeah.
You know what? I was just thinking what it comes down to also for me is the stakes in this movie. Like when you go back to Jaws and even Jaws 2, like you just feel like the stakes are incredibly high. Mm-hmm. Like with Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw are out on the open sea battling the shark. Like you feel like the stakes are really fucking high, and like it may not end well for all three of these gentlemen. And even Jaws 2 with the kids on the sailboat, like, you feel like there's some stakes there. I never felt the stakes of Jaws 3. Like even when like the tourists from SeaWorld are trapped in the underwater kingdom, this may be me misremembering decades later, but even when I was in the theater, I never felt like they were really in a ton of danger, and knew that they were going to be freed and everything was going to turn out okay for them. So I think it kind of failed in raising those stakes, to kind of just really center it on your main characters of like, are they going to get through this or are they not going to get through this?
Yes.
Like it just wasn't there.
And something that you said early on, connecting with what you said now, watching it for this episode, I never felt they were in danger because this was like that Bruce Willis movie, Striking Distance. It's Bruce Willis on a boat. So as long as you commit your crimes on land, he can't get you in this movie, except if there's a body of water next to the bank you're robbing, and then he will find you down that canal, and then Bruce Willis will find you. He will get you. In this one, the shark's only real avenue to get to those people is to crush, destroy this glass, which it does. But if they're just going through tunnel to tunnel, I'm not really feeling like they're in any type of danger as long as they just keep moving. But then I think that's where what you had said earlier, if they had put them in maybe more distress where those tunnels are underwater and they're leaking, and there's now a case where you could see the shark or sharks making their way through this area because those tunnels are tight enough where unless then you see the shark coming at them because the whole thing is glass anyway. So you're like, you have to give me some shadows, some power outages, a lot of the stuff that, again, going to like back to Aliens, a lot of the stuff that Cameron did successfully in that movie. Ridley Scott played on the horror in space theme, but I'm still going to take advantage of slow reveals and shadows and feeling claustrophobic. This one, exactly. I think to your point, you do that in this movie, and guys, you don't have to change too much for us to talk about this in the same category again as Jaws 2, where they're like, oh, different movie in the franchise, but still okay.
Yeah, you nailed it. If they could have ramped up the claustrophobia in the underwater kingdom there while the people are like trying to maneuver through it, you're tapping into genuine fears that people have, and that is provoking a better audience reaction. And again, like, yes, the shark bangs into the glass tube so that it's leaking, and they have to like close like seal off the one section, and the water's rising, but again, like I never felt like any of those people were in danger. I'm like, they're not going to kill off all these random people. But like if you had packed that in with like your main cast, just kind of wreaking havoc on the thing, and they, and all of a sudden becomes like a cat and mouse thing.
Absolutely.
How do we get to these people, get them out, get ourselves out? I feel like that's just, again, I think that's a tighter, more focused movie than what Jaws 3D ultimately turned out to be.
Our shark still has all its teeth.
Yeah.
That means it was a baby. Our shark couldn't have killed Overman. Its mother did.
You're talking about the damn shark's mother?
Calvin, don't you hear what she's saying here?
Well, I'm listening. Now, if there is such a thing, she gave birth way out to sea, and the baby swam through the sea gate that you left open, Rhodey.
No. Overman was killed inside the park. The baby was caught inside the park. Its mother is inside the park.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan Podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
Now we return to Jaws 3, starring Bess Armstrong and Dennis Quaid.
Now, I did find a little bit of trivia. I think this movie, we were able to find a few things about it. The producer, Alan Landsberg, and I guess he'd come from TV. So part of the story is after the studio realizes they don't want to go the parody route, they get rid of David Zanuck and Brown, who had David Brown, I think his name is, who had produced Animal House and Airplane. And then they find Alan Landsberg, who was going to move forward. And then he brought in Joe Alves, get that connection with the production of 1 and 2. And he had produced like In Search Of, and I think Give Me a Break and some stuff for TV. So I didn't see he had feature film cred at that time, but nevertheless, he wanted to use some National Geographic footage. They didn't give him permission, but he still wound up using, I guess, like 90 seconds of it in the movie, probably to help flesh out with the ocean life and maybe shots of sharks swimming and doing things that were either cost prohibitive or weren't available to them. So he used it anyway, turned into like a $50,000 lawsuit. They settled out of court. Pretty ballsy to just say, hey, guys, we didn't get permission to use it. So, use it.
I think he is Roger Corman.
Exactly. He was no Roger Corman, that's for sure. It was released on VHD, which is a format that has come up but once before when we've talked about these 3D movies. And I've read into it a little bit more this time. It seems like it was a format primarily released in Japan that was similar to Laserdisc and did a very good job of maintaining, better resolution to VHS for sure, but could also duplicate the 3D effects so you could take advantage of that for a home release. So this was released that way. Broadcast TV, so maybe when you eventually saw it on Pixa on Long Island, they obviously couldn't use the 3D effects, so they only used the left lens of the camera. Because a lot of the stuff I read online, folks were talking about, one, the way they did the effects did not work out well, to the point that the byproduct is kind of like a grainy, blurry picture at times, especially when they're doing composite shots that didn't work out well. I guess the way they decided to do the effects for it. And then in the broadcast release, they're like, that's really more evident, I guess, in wide angle shots. And I saw a few videos online where they showed examples, you get the water skiers in the background to kind of establish the amusement park, this SeaWorld type place. I didn't even notice that it is out of focus. And I guess that was unfortunately the byproduct of not being able to see it in 3D. And it didn't seem like they were taking shortcuts, but they had made some decisions in the production that later on impacted the quality of the film, of the print that they were able to go to release later. Alves did not direct another movie after this. So you think with his pedigree, Close Encounters, worked with Spielberg quite a few times, Jaws, in some ways, maybe that's a awareness to know that maybe directing isn't your thing, but you can do other things and do them incredibly well, like Academy Award winning nomination well. But that was kind of sad when I'm like, oh, I hope that wasn't the reason why he didn't move forward with that. But kind of mentioned it earlier too. The studio did move forward with Jaws 4 that is ridiculous, and as a lot of these watches tend to do for me, Pete, yes, it is in my queue, and I will be watching Jaws 4 now, because now I have to finish this off. Just like this reminded me a bit too of a recent first time watch for me. It was Orca, the Killer Whale.
Oh yeah.
It was a movie that you'd seen before, right? Kind of growing up, sure. You had caught it.
Yeah, this is it's definitely an early VHS rental.
Certainly would have been in the wave of movies that they would have released because of the popularity of Jaws in 75. And watching Jaws 3, I was thinking about the plot for Orca and how you have Richard Harris going out there as, this sort of Moby Dick type character in Ahab, right? That's going out and killing whales, happens to kill the mate of a whale that's has an unborn baby, and in a very talk about gnarly effects, the fetus is just launched onto the deck, and that was just gnarly. That plot line of the father in that case kind of getting revenge for the death of his mate and unborn baby, I wonder if that had an impact on this. These things are in production, and there's just the zeitgeist, and they're kind of swimming in the same waters, no pun intended here. Would it have been a case where maybe you play that up, they basically capture the baby shark, and that's why now our 35-foot mama shark is going to go on a tear? It's again, guys, it's all there. I just wish you'd leaned into it. And maybe then we'd be talking a little bit more glowingly about Jaws 3. But nevertheless, I'm glad we saw it. Another one in our 80s 3D marathon that we can check off the list. Yeah. And for sure, one of the big ones. Because, when we talk about this, we've kind of gone around the edges, right? We still haven't hit up Friday the 13th or Amityville. And when you think of 3D 80 movies, those are the ones that are kind of synonymous with the gimmick, with the trend. And now with Jaws 3D, off our queue, it's like, yep, we still have some more to watch, but kind of cool to see these movies in that lens, 80s 3D movies, what they were able to do, what they weren't able to do, and especially in this one, part of a franchise too.
Yeah, and and getting to do some of that research to see where that connective tissue is, like looking at the credits and seeing, Joe Alves, Carl Gottlieb, Richard Matheson. Like, I had no idea that he was involved in the screenplay for this. So I'm like, wow, these are these are names that anyone that is a fan of films or books would know. Yeah, I'm fascinated how these things, the finished product, what we end up seeing, how it gets there from what the germination of the idea was. One thing to base your film off of a best-selling novel like Jaws, but you still been documented many times in movies and books on how Jaws is made. But then how do you get to Jaws 2, and how does that take shape? And the different iterations of screenplays that were before what we ended up seeing on screen there. And then same thing with Jaws 3. And it's like, if there are multiverses out there, maybe there's that different version of Jaws 3D where they went with the original screenplay and that thing got made and it was a bigger hit, or was more or better well received. Who knows? We'll never know the answer to these things probably, but it's fun to kind of just muse about, as well as seeing. I got a kick out of on the opening credits when
Is it the suggested by the novel by Peter Benchley?
Suggested by the novel Jaws by Peter Benchley. Yes. Like, that's an interesting, that might be a legal term to be like suggested by.
Sure.
If Universal's legal team was like, yeah, let's go with that. But I got a kick out of seeing that.
Yeah. I'd like to think that helped maybe pay for Mr. Benchley's like remodel of his home at that time. If that was enough, then like, good on you, sir. I hope that worked out, because they were certainly mining territory that you set up, that Spielberg was able to make iconic and just kind of continue in the franchise. So yeah, Jaws 3 could have been better, could be worse. Would you say, Pete, is it? And I don't want to put you in a place where you have to say it's a bad movie, but would you say it's in a so bad it's good category?
No, I don't think it rises to so bad it's good. I think there are moments that do. I would certainly, anyone that's a fan of Jaws and hasn't seen it, I would certainly recommend watching it. I can't say the same about Jaws 4, but everyone, people want to be completists, so knock your socks off. Again, as a piece of 1980s cinema, and as a piece of like that 80s 3D mini resurgence that existed, I think it's an interesting watch to kind of see again, like, how do we get from Jaws to Jaws 3 in the span of, at that point, 8 years, like, just to kind of see the progression of where it made itself. Definitely very interesting. But yeah, no, I don't think it rises to so bad it's good, unfortunately. If it did, I would watch it and rewatch it a lot more than I do. It just doesn't get there, again, because of what we've talked about. There's the parts that drag. You just can't even have fun with it. You can't even enjoy that for what it is. And then the lack of tension, it's not like so over the top bad where you're just like, this is ridiculous. Again, a couple of scenes aside. So yeah, for me, it's out there. It exists. I know it's there, and I appreciate that it exists. But I feel like I've had my fill of Jaws 3 for the foreseeable future.
Would you say it doesn't hold water? That maybe it sinks more than it swims? Insert whatever underwater pun you would like to have here.
Yeah, to put it in terms of the film, the gates to the lagoon are permanently damaged.
That's exactly
the damn gate won't close.
That's right. Yes, we'll close the gates on the episode. How about that?
Nice.